as you heard Andrea say, we're kicking off a new series this morning that we've titled Hope in Hard Times. And we're going to make our way this October through the book of Habakkuk. I don't know when you read Habakkuk last, probably last week. You didn't pick up your Bible and go, I'm going to read Habakkuk. Most of us haven't. But Habakkuk is a book about a man wrestling with this question, God, where are you when I hurt so much? Why does it seem like you're silent? That's what Habakkuk is doing. I don't think I thought much as a pastor about the whole idea of suffering until it was the final year of my PhD program. We were living in Chicago, but we were moving to East Africa where I was going to teach at African Bible College. And I was going to, at the same time, finish my dissertation. And so before I left, I had one final meeting with my program advisor, Dr. Perry Downs. And as I'm leaving his office, just as I'm getting up, he said, oh, Palmer, by the way, while you're in Africa, I think you need to teach a course titled A Theology of Suffering. I said, you want me to teach a class titled A Theology of Suffering? He says, yes, I think you need to do that. Well, I didn't know much about a theology of suffering, but I wanted him to approve my dissertation and I wanted to graduate. And so I said, okay, I'll teach it, Dr. Downs. So I headed down to a Christian bookstore and bought just about every book I could find on pain and suffering and what the Bible says about it. Landed in Malawi. I told the registrar, I said, put me down for a theology of suffering. Will be one of the classes I teach this semester. And the registrar said, no one's ever taught that class before. I said, you think? Okay, well, I'm going to figure this out. And so I was surprised quite a few students signed up. And the first day of class, I still remember like it was yesterday. I said to them, I said, help me see what your hard times are in East Africa. Help me know and understand what your worldview is of pain and suffering. So I said, I invited the students, would you write on the board, on the chalkboard, what some of the things are that you've had to deal with? And so one at a time, they started to come up and write things on the chalkboard. The first student wrote, corruption in the hospital. I said, what's corruption in the hospital? And he explained, he said, well, when you go to the hospital, nobody will see you. The doctors won't see you, the nurses won't see you until you start bribing people. So if you're just sick, that's not enough. You have to bribe a lot of people to see anybody. I go, man, it sounds like our healthcare system in America, doesn't it? That's what I thought. And the next person writes, property grabbing. I said, what's property grabbing? They said, well, when someone dies, their relatives come from the villages and they start grabbing and taking their property, leaving the children with nothing. Another one writes, the orphans of AIDS. In Malawi at the time, there were over 1 million orphans of AIDS. Another one writes, the child brides. You see the 10-year-olds and the 9-year-olds and the 11-year-old girls are being forced to marry grown men. Another one wrote, starvation in the north. I go, I didn't know people were starving in the north. And they were. They said in the dry season in Mazuzu, there's not enough maize. So some fathers have enough to feed their family, but not enough to feed themselves. So they literally eat dirt. This is a true story. They say it takes the hunger pangs away. I didn't know that. Another one writes, the albino sacrifices by the witch doctors. Albinos were being killed. And so they filled the board with all of these things. A lot of them I had never thought much about. Well, then I asked them to start reading the books with me that I had brought. And together, for example, we read Ragamuffin Gospel by Brennan Manning. And in it, if you don't have this book, you need it. Brennan Manning writes about how Jesus found solidarity with all of us who hurt. That Jesus spent a disproportionate amount of his time with the people who were suffering, going through hard times, the least and the last. And then we read Henry Nouwen's The Wounded Healer. And Henry Nouwen, he writes about how Jesus Christ himself suffered, but because of his wounds, we are healed and find salvation. And then he says this, now the wounded one is the healer who sits with us. In our times of trouble, Jesus sits with us. That's the wounded healer. And then we read C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain. It's a short classic. And C.S. Lewis says the most interesting thing in here that still stands out to me. He says, often we blame God for our trouble. But he said, when you think about it, it's the people around you who cause the most trouble in your life. Usually people that we love the most hurt us the worst. One more that we read, but my son stole it and took it to college this semester. It's Shiseku Indu's novel, Silence. And in it, Indu keeps asking the question, where is God in the silence of the trouble? Why isn't he answering my prayers? And that's almost exactly what Habakkuk is saying in his short writing. Well, after 3 years in Malawi, I finished my PhD, finished the dissertation, graduated, came back to Chandler. And as soon as we got to Chandler, I'll be honest, I forgot all about a theology of suffering because Chandler at the time was the fastest growing community in the nation. So we had brand new freeways, brand new malls, brand new subdivisions. Life looked too perfect for there to be suffering, much pain and suffering in Chandler. We moved into a subdivision with perfectly manicured lawns. We even had an HOA, and some of you despise HOAs, but HOAs make you do things like take out your trash and mow your lawn and paint your garage when it gets faded. HOAs do that. I never lived in a place with an HOA. So how could there be pain and suffering in a place like this? And then I remember I'd only been here like a month, and I'm in a restaurant, walk in, and I see a guy who I hadn't seen for over 3 years since I left for Africa. And I said, how are you doing? We all say that. And he goes, I'm doing terrible. Well, who says that? And I said, why do you say that? He said, well, you know, my wife filed for divorce. I said, no, I didn't know that, and I'm sorry. And he said, now I'm going to court today because she's trying to gain sole custody of my kids. Palmer, I just want to see my kids 2 or 3 days a week. You could sense, you could feel the anguish in his voice. And then soon after that, and maybe you were here at the time, the recession started. And in our small church, for the first time, I saw family or person, man and woman after woman, lose their jobs. And for the first time in my life, I saw people lose their houses and have them foreclosed on and file for bankruptcy. One family I knew even got in their van after they lost their house and started driving to relative around the country just for a place to sleep. And then it hit me. Whether you live in Arizona or Africa, life will have hard times. Life will have suffering. And because of all this, I wrote a book I titled God Can't Sleep. The phrase God can't sleep is a Liberian phrase from where I grew up. And Liberians, they say this to each other. If the worst thing happens to you, then your friends will try to encourage you and they'll say, God can't sleep. You know, I know it hurts right now, but God will take care of this. God will make it right. God will bring justice. God can't sleep. And that's the same thing that David says in Psalm 121, isn't it? He says, he who watches over you, he neither slumbers nor he sleeps. So we start this series to talk about where is God in hard times. And can I just say to you today, if you're going through something really hard, I'm sorry. And I'm sorry that you're having to deal with it. But that's why we want to go through this series to kind of wrestle with what God says and where he is in the most difficult things that we deal with. So open your Bibles with me to Habakkuk. And he's one of the minor prophets. And I'm going to start reading in verse 2. Verse 1, we read that Habakkuk looks around and all that he sees is trouble. So this is the elegy of Habakkuk. We read this. How long, O Lord, must I cry for help? But you do not answer me or listen. Or how long do I have to cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict. It all abounds. Move down to verse 13. He says, your eyes are too pure to look at evil, God. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous than themselves? So do you hear his complaints here? But Habakkuk is this short book about sorrow and hope. It's about failure and starting again. It's about pain and healing. Habakkuk lived in about 620 BC, 620 years before Christ. He is one of the prophets that writes to the Israelites During his time, Babylon ruled the known world. They had the most powerful army. They were the superpower of the day. But worse than that, they were the arch nemesis and the rival and the sworn enemy of the Israelite people. The Israelites could not stand them. And so Habakkuk is writing during this time. And he begins by writing and saying, but his writing is different than most of the other prophets. He doesn't condemn or write against the Israelite people. Instead, his argument is with God. It's the most interesting conversation maybe in the whole Bible. The first 2 chapters are this dialogue between Habakkuk and God. And in chapters 1 and 2, Habakkuk brings 2 complaints, and then we get 2 answers back from God. And the thing is, his complaints are this: why are the righteous suffering? Why do the worst things happen to the best people and the wicked people are prospering? You see, because most of us, we think like Habakkuk, don't we? We think if we take enough precautions and if we live as the right kind of Christians, then the worst things won't happen to us. In fact, they say that all people have this psychological defense mechanism in us. It's this built-in mechanism that when we see someone go through something hard, like a car accident, or their house catches on fire, we think, well, that will never happen to me. They were just unlucky. Too bad for them. But those kinds of things don't. We all think that way. You know what? If they hadn't used those darn cedar shakes, their house wouldn't burn down. They just used the cement tiles like we have in Arizona, everything would be fine. And we tend to think like that. For example, I've already decided that when my car goes off the bridge and into the lagoon, I'm not gonna die. You know, you see it in the movies all the time. It's gonna happen to most of us here, where you end up in a lagoon and your car's sinking. I'm not gonna be the guy going, help, help, I can't get out, I can't get out. No, I'm busting a window. I know how to break a window. I've read about how to break a window when your car is going down. In fact, I was at a friend's house and he has this book on a table and it's titled Worst Case Scenario Survival Guide. By the way, you all need a copy. It's using the phrase book loosely. It's more like a pamphlet, but it has chapters on like worst case scenarios, like your car going off a bridge and into a lagoon. And so here's a few other chapters. How to survive a poisonous snake bite and escape a boa constrictor. I mean, these are important things. How to jump from a moving car or from a rooftop into a dumpster. You better plan on this, all right? You better start thinking now. I do. I don't know about you. Okay. How to hide things in your dorm room, or for many of you here, in your prison cell. How to escape quicksand, or how to escape a meeting in plain sight. These are whole chapters. So here's the truth, though. More seriously, if you think about it, trouble comes on all of us. No matter how many precautions we take, no matter how much planning we do, no matter how much canned goods we put in our basement, you can't stop hard times from coming. They happen. They happen to everyone. If you're not going through something difficult right now, I hate to say it, but it's probably coming sometime soon. The question is, well, not too soon. Somebody over here, not too soon. But the question is, how will you respond? What will your response be? Well, let's see how Habakkuk handles this. He says this, his first complaint to God is this: God, why are you silent? Why are you letting this happen? I want to read verse 2 again, this time from the Message Bible. How many times do I have to yell, help, before you come to the rescue? Verse 13, why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those who are more righteous than themselves? God, why do you let this happen? Like I said, I think Habakkuk is asking the question that we all end up asking when the worst thing happens. Why is this, God? Why are you letting this happen? Some call it the problem of pain or the problem of evil. I have this, this kind of describes this whole idea that Habakkuk is wrestling with. If we have a God who is all loving, all powerful, and all good, who controls the universe, why is there so much evil and so much suffering and so much pain? Why do we have natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes and car crashes and sickness and pandemics? And why do the worst things sometimes happen to the best people? So that's the problem of pain. More briefly, it's often said like this: if God is all powerful and God is all good, then why do the worst things happen to the best people? And maybe you've had those thoughts. Maybe you've had those questions. And maybe right now, this is where you are. Something is happening to you and you're saying, God, why? What have I done to deserve this? Why me? Maybe right now you're saying to God, God, why are you letting this business partner turn on me and harm me and take money from me? Or maybe you're asking this, God, why are you letting this person say those things at work about me and ruin my reputation? Or maybe you're saying, God, why does everyone else at work, why does it seem like they're all getting promotions and they're all getting raises? And you know, God, I work harder than them and I'm smarter than them. Why not me? Or maybe it's something like you're saying, God, why are you letting me go through this sickness? Or why do I have these financial hard times? Or why am I wrestling with depression or anxiety? I think we all end up asking the same question. The trouble is, I think most Christians, if we think about it, don't have a well thought out answer to this. Most of us don't have a great theology of suffering and pain yet. And so I think sometimes Christians end up giving bad answers or glib answers, like everything happens for a reason. Christians say that. Or we say things like, well, if you had a little more faith, God would heal you. Or maybe it's the sin in your life that's causing God to punish you. And none of those answers you'll find in the Bible. Growing up, I used to hear Christians talk about pain and suffering as though we should be immune to it. I don't know if this was a case in your church growing up, but in my church, if someone was going through something difficult, you're supposed to act like you were stoic and you could withstand it and it didn't bother you at all. Because if you seemed to suffer and if you seemed to be angry about your pain, then it meant that you lost faith in God or something like that. And I think sometimes we hide our pain and our suffering because we think people around us will see it as a scourge and won't want to spend time with us. And I think most of us, like Habakkuk, not only do we ask why, but we don't like the silence of God, do we? You see, silence doesn't fit so well in our culture. We live in a fairly loud society, don't we? If you think about it, I'm told now that you can buy noisemakers on Amazon. Some of you do this. People say, I sleep better with noise. I don't know how you sleep better with noise, but some people do and spend money on that. I've heard that some people, when they leave their home in the morning for work, they turn on their TV so the dog doesn't have to deal with silence. I've heard this. Maybe you do it. But can I tell you this? If you're wondering what your dog's doing when you're not home, he's not worried about the TV being on. He's not watching Jeopardy. He's either sleeping or soiling your carpet. One of the two. One of those. Maybe you don't know this, and that's why you're leaving the TV on. But the Bible reminds us about this, that God is in the silence. We read this interesting passage about the prophet Elijah, that he says, I'm waiting to hear from God. So he goes up on Mount Sinai, and I got to climb Mount Sinai a few years ago. And he says he stood in the cleft of the rock. And I think I've been in the exact same spot, because just before you reach the summit, there's these two huge slabs of rock that go up about 40 feet, and they create a hallway, and you can look out into the valley. And so he's standing there. And then he says, God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the noise of the rushing wind. God was not in the fire or the lightning or the thunder. I didn't hear God in all of that noise. Then he says this. He says, God was in the silence. We don't like the silence, but God is there, and he's speaking, and he's doing something. There's this great line in the book of Revelation where we read, there was silence in heaven for about 30 minutes. What an interesting line. Well, if there is silence in heaven, we know God was there. And my point is, if God is present during the silence in heaven, then during the silence on earth, God is there. So whatever you're going through today, I just want to remind you that God is there with us. Now, God gives a response to Habakkuk, and God says this, I hear your cry, and I have a plan. So let's go back to verse 5, and we read this. Look at the nations and watch, and you will be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who will sweep across the whole earth. So what is God saying? He says, I hear you. I am not silent. I see you. I'm listening. And then this is the best part. God is saying, and I have a plan. But we know already, before we even get to what Habakkuk said, Habakkuk is not going to like his plan, because God's plan, we read, is to use the Babylonians to punish the Jewish people, or really to bring them back to God. You know, God says, I'm using the Babylonians. The point here is, though, that God hears our cries. And not only does he hear us, but he has a big, larger plan at work. He's in control of it all. Even though you can't see it all, he's in control of it all. I think sometimes we see just an inch when God's plan is like a mile long. We only see just a glimpse of what's happening. We just see a day at a time. But he has this plan that stretches for years, even for sometimes for decades. But he has this mile-long plan, and we only get to see the first inch of it. As I was thinking about this week, I thought about my friend Chris. And Chris has been one of my lifelong friends. He was in our wedding. We invited him to sing. Side note, he missed the first note badly, and then he forgot the lyrics. On the Wings of Love, by the way. Anyway, but he kept going. That was important. And then he invited me to be in his wedding, and he's that kind of friend. But then like 3 years after he and Debbie were married, Veronica and I were visiting them, and he shared with me, he said, Palmer, he said, we've been trying to get pregnant, and it doesn't look like we're gonna be able to have kids. And I said, man, I'll be praying for you. And he said, it's really causing a lot of conflict and trouble in our marriage, and we've just been down. And it was heavy on them. 2 years later, they still couldn't have kids. And they had been to, it seemed like every fertility clinic in the Seattle area. They had tried one treatment after another. Nothing was working. But right about the 5-year mark, and Chris was the regional director of Young Life, there was a girl in their ministry who was at their church. And she was just a teenage girl, and she was pregnant, but she didn't want to keep the baby. So Chris and Debbie went to her home, and they said, look, if you keep the baby, we'll adopt your baby. And if you have the baby, we'll give it a home. And so she delivered the baby. And Chris and Debbie had this brand new baby girl, and they fell in love with this baby girl. It wasn't like they had been planning to adopt or looking to adopt. It was just happenstance, but they fell in love so quickly. Then, because they loved her so much, 2 years later, they adopted a baby boy. So now they had a baby boy and a baby girl. About a year later, they heard of a friend who had a friend in Ireland who was having a baby and could not keep the baby. And so they flew to Ireland. They adopted another baby girl. So now they have 3 kids in just like 3 years. And right about this same time, Chris had flown to Malawi to visit his father, who was teaching there, his parents. And while he was there, he had gone downtown Lilongwe. And when he was telling me this, he starts to tear up. He says, Palmer, in downtown Lilongwe at sunset, in the abandoned buildings behind the stores, dozens, maybe even 100 kids gather together to find kind of shelter and safety, and they sleep together. And he says there's dozens and dozens of these kids, because of the AIDS epidemic, don't have a home, and the relatives of their mother and father who've already died can't feed them, so they're out on the streets. And he said when he saw it, he just stood there and wept as he talked to these kids in Lilongwe. Well, when he came back to Seattle, he told his wife, Debbie, he said, I'm quitting my job. He said, we need to do something about the orphans in Malawi. And so he started Children of the Nations, and then he flew to Malawi, and he started homes for kids, not just orphanages, but he would start a home where he would put a mother and a father, a couple, and then they would bring in only like half a dozen or maybe 8 kids in each home, so that the kids would have a father and a mother in their house who would help them with their homework and help them get ready for school in the morning and do their hair and things like that. And then he started a second home and a third home. Then he had dozens of homes. And then a friend from Sierra Leone said, Chris, can you come over to Sierra Leone? He said, our civil war is just ending, but there's all kinds of orphans from the war. So he goes to Sierra Leone and he starts houses for orphans in Sierra Leone. And then he does the same thing in the Dominican Republic, and then Haiti after the earthquake. And I share that to say I've been into some of these homes with Chris. And every time, whether it's the DR or whether it's Malawi, when I walk into the home and the kids see Chris, their faces light up and they come running at him. And they all are yelling the same thing, whether they're yelling it in Spanish or Chichewa or French or Creole or English. They're all yelling, Papa Chris, Papa Chris, and they jump in his arms. But they all call him Papa Chris. All over the world, these hundreds and hundreds of kids know him as Papa Chris. So here, this friend of mine, who he and his wife could not have any children, and they felt the pain of that. Now he is father and she is mother to hundreds and hundreds of kids around the world. Do you see what I'm saying? That sometimes we just see an inch when God has this long-range plan that sometimes spans years, and we don't see it all at once. But God has a plan. I hear your cry, and I have a plan. Well, that brings us to what Habakkuk says next. Habakkuk lodges his second complaint, and it's simple. He says this. He says, God, I don't like your plan. I don't like it a bit. It's a bad plan, God. Look at verse 12. God, you chose the Babylonians for your judgment work. Rock solid God. This out of the Message Bible. You gave them the job of discipline. You can't be serious. I love how that reads. Come on, God. The Babylonians are the worst. They're the filthy people of the earth. And you're letting them do your work in our lives? That can't be. He said, I don't like your plan. Habakkuk is saying, how can a holy God use wicked people like the Babylonians? Has that ever been something that you felt? Have you felt that kind of frustration? God, how can you let this mean-spirited person do that to me? How could you let? And look at this. Not only that, they're succeeding in what they're doing in work or their family, and they're the worst person ever, God. For example, down in verse 16, we read this, with their nets, they become rich and live in luxury. He says this in verse 15, the Babylonians catch people with their hooks as though they were fish. They drag them off in their nets, and they shout for joy over their catch. So Habakkuk is saying, the Babylonians do the worst thing to other people, then they celebrate. At least the NFL has a penalty for this. It's called taunting. You know, it's 15 yards. But God, you're going to use these bad kind of people. And maybe this is you right now. God has a plan, and you don't like it. But the truth is, we all have our Babylonians in our lives. And there's always a part of that hard time that we don't like. And maybe today you're saying, God, I don't like this sickness that you're letting me go through. God, I don't like what's happening in my marriage. Please heal it now. Or I don't like what's happening with my job or with my son or my daughter. Can you change things now? And I would just ask you to pause right now and ask yourself, what is your Babylon? Or who is your Babylon? Because as much as we don't like it, maybe God is using it to shape you. We read in chapter 2, verse 1, that Habakkuk climbs. He says, I'm going to climb up to my watchtower and stand at my guard post. There I will wait and see what the Lord says and how he will answer my complaint. So he just gives up. He says, I'm going to go sit on the wall, and I'm not doing a thing, God, until you fix everything that you made a mess of. That's what he's saying. And God answers one more time, and God says, wait, be patient, believe. Habakkuk, you're so frustrated and worked up. Just wait, be patient, and believe. He says this in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3. Then the Lord replied, this vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will surely be fulfilled. It may be slow in coming, but wait patiently, for it will surely take place. So God is saying, Habakkuk, it may be happening slower than you want, maybe happening slower than you think, but I am at work. And then there's this great line in verse 4 where he says, the righteous will live by faith. So God is saying, look, just believe, just trust me. I have a plan. I'm at work. I'm in control of it all. I haven't lost control of the universe, but you have to believe that God has this bigger plan, this long-range plan, and he's at work in Habakkuk's life, and he's at work in your life.